Hello, all, and welcome to Bennis Stories, a series of interviews with people who knew, loved, were influenced by, worked with, wrote with, were students and mentees of Warren Bennis. This is Kate Bennis, Warren's daughter. This series is created for the Warren Bennis Leadership Institute at the University of Cincinnati's Lindner College of Business. My partner in this endeavor is Betsy Myers. Betsy was a dear friend of Dad's and a colleague, and worked with him at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government as its executive director. She has also been a senior advisor to both President Clinton and President Obama, and also is a senior advisor to the Warren Bennis Leadership Institute. Today, Betsy and I are delighted to welcome Doug Conant. Doug got to know Dad in the last years of Dad's life. He would travel across the country to meet Dad for breakfast at the Viceroy in Santa Monica and talk through what would become his book, Touchpoints, published under Dad's imprint at Wiley Press. Doug is the only former Fortune 500 CEO who is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, a top 50 leadership innovator, a top 100 leadership speaker, and one of the 100 most influential authors in the world. He is founder and CEO of Conant Leadership, former president and CEO of Campbell's Soup Company, former president of Nabisco Foods, and former chairman of Avon Products. His latest Wall Street Journal best-selling book, co-authored with Amy Fetterman, The Blueprint, 6 Practical Steps to Lift Your Leadership to New Heights, is a seminal treatise on leadership and practical guide for leading effectively in a chaotic world. He is also the New York Times bestselling co-author with Mette Norgård of Touchpoints, the book we mentioned before, creating powerful leadership connections in the smallest of moments. In his 10 years at Campbell's Soup, Doug famously hand-wrote 30,000 personal thank you notes to his employees. Welcome, Doug. Let's get started.
I used to worry about how I sounded, how I looked, what I said, but at this point, doesn't matter.
Right. Do you feel like that's a good thing for a leader in a strange way? Dad tells a story about Ben Zander. Do you remember who that?
Yeah.
The conductor of the youth orchestra in Boston. He told a great story about a cellist who was always number 2. He would go all over the world competing, and he was always number 2. And one day he started getting to be number 1. And Ben said, "What happened?" And he said, "I just said, fuck it." So Ben Zander talked about getting beyond the fuck it, like just to that point where you can say the truth, be your best, improvise, trust the process. Is that how you feel?
I've written a lot about this, but the short course is that I was the oldest of 4 boys. So I was heavily influenced by my grandparents and my parents. And then I went to school. I was trying to do what they wanted me to do. Yeah. And then I went to school and I was doing what my teachers wanted me to do. Then I was playing sports and I was doing what my coaches wanted me to do. Then I went to college and it was my professors. Then I went to work and it was my bosses. And Brene Brown has this beautiful quote, which was my quote of the year 3 years ago. And she said, "You can either walk inside your story and own it, or you can stand outside of your story and hustle for your worthiness every day." And I was hustling for my worthiness, walking inside the stories that other people were writing for me. And it took me a long time to get comfortable with walking inside my story. And it wasn't until I was fired from a job and tested time and again that I started to climb out of that hole. And actually, there were more than 2, but 2 people had a profound influence on me. One was Stephen Covey, the other one was your father. And they were both helping me get grounded in who I was and how I wanted to walk in the world. And, you know, your dad obviously wrote a lot of books. I mean, that's what he did. He thought, wrote, and communicated his thoughts beautifully. The first book I read of his was On Becoming a Leader. And I said, wow, this guy's got some juice. He's got something here. And I was well aware of him before that because I've been a fan of studying leadership for the longest time as I was trying to walk inside of other people's stories. But then I had this habit, and this actually happened with Stephen Covey and your dad. I had this habit of buying a hardcover book in the bookstore in the airport before I got on a plane. I was going to pick the book that spoke to me at the time. And the first book that was like that, that really had an impact on me, was Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits. I got it. I'd never heard of him when I bought it at the airport. This was in the 90s. And I totally ignored my wife the whole trip. We were going away for the first time, just the two of us, since our second child was born. We were going down to the Breakers in Palm Beach. We were in first class, having mimosas. My wife was having a great time, and I've got my nose in this damn book. And then we get to the Breakers Hotel, and they take us up to our room, and they open the windows because we're facing the ocean. And I'm still reading this book. I sit down, and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "This guy is absolutely brilliant." And she said, "Why? Who is it? Why?" And I said, "Well, he's brilliant because he thinks just like I do." And he was putting words to what I was thinking. And I had the same experience with a lesser known of your dad's books. I was going through the airport, and I was working in the Shark Tank of KKR, working on the world's largest leverage buyout, LBO, and which was RJR Nabisco. And I was a simple guy from the Midwest, and here I was in the Shark Tank in Wall Street, and for a decade. And that was where I found my voice, because you didn't have a choice. Otherwise, you'd be eaten alive. But I saw this book, and I said, "God, this guy gets it." I saw the title, but I didn't see your dad's name at first, because the title was much larger on this book. And the title of the book was Leading People's Like Herding Cats. And I had so many cats involved in trying to make money off the world's largest LBO and just trying to survive in a real toxic situation. Nobody's doing really, it just sort of happened. And I'm trying to lead these people to higher ground, and it was just exhausting because it was like herding cats. And that just spoke to me. And then I dove into Warren Bennis. I just dove in, went to school on him. And I said to my wife, same thing, "This guy's brilliant." "Well, why?" "He thinks just like I do." And then I'm going to fast track as long as I'm on the roll here. I write my first book with co-author Meta Norgard called Touch Points. Yeah. And we're working with Wiley, and I'm working with Susan Williams, who I was connected with by Bill George, who's a friend. Bill's about a decade ahead of me. He was just retiring when I was just becoming a CEO. And I had him come to speak to my leadership group the year after he retired or something, in the early 2000s. I had gone to be CEO at Campbell in 2000 and January 8th, 2001, and probably had Bill come, I would guess, in 2003. I'd been CEO for a few years, and I read his book on authentic leadership, True North. And I said to my wife, "This guy's brilliant. He thinks just like I do." So Bill and I became friends. I said to Bill, who publishing your books? Who should I talk to? He said Susan Williams. Susan worked with Warren, and Susan loved Warren. Well, who didn't? Anybody who worked with him, especially at that stage. I don't know what he was like to work with earlier in life, but at that stage, Susan loved him. She said, "This should be a Warren Bennis book. You should talk to Warren." I was like a kid going to his first Major League Baseball game to get an autograph from his favorite baseball player. I flew out to California. I had just retired. I was just retiring. I hadn't retired yet. I was still a CEO. I flew out to California and spent some time with your dad at the Viceroy, and started this series of trips back and forth, just talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and leadership. And I felt after 4 or 5 trips, what do they say? When the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Yeah.
He appeared to me in the flesh at a time when I was really ready to meet him because I was just retiring. That book was published in 2011. I was just wrapping up. So it was probably 2010. I retired in 2011 and published the book as part of Warren's collection. He wrote something in the front, and I was just ready because I was now contemplating my next chapter, which I knew was going to involve leadership, and I knew I was going to beat of a different drum than most CEOs. And I had things to say, and I had finally found my voice, going back to what Kate asked originally. I had finally found my voice. I'm slow. Part of this is I'm just slow. Guys are slow. I'm slow. But I found my voice. I was almost 60 at the time. But, eventually I got it. In fact, it's hard to get me to stop talking now. But I've been talking ever since. So that's a little background on Warren. And dear man.
When he passed away, you wrote that beautiful article about your breakfast at Viceroy with Warren.
Yeah.
That it seems like that relationship with him and the breakfast influenced you as you went forward. As you said, you were in this kind of crucial time of leaving and moving into becoming an author and leadership expert. Can you talk more about those breakfasts and how your relationship with Warren influenced you?
Well, let's be clear. I've only written, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think I've written only 2 of those mini blogs. One was about Warren. The other one was about a fellow by the name of John Whitehead, who was an amazing fellow who I had a chance to work with in New York, who had been chair of Goldman Sachs. But what was amazing about Warren was he was able to always take the high road. He was an investment banker as good as they come. He was also Undersecretary of State, I think during Reagan, maybe. I mean, he was a really capable guy, but he came from Pennsylvania. He went to Haverford College, which is like so intellectually honest, it's painful. And he was that way. He was just sincere and honest. He took the high road, and he was wildly successful on Wall Street in New York in the 80s and 90s when it was all about money. The only 2 people I ever wrote about. I was moved to write about Warren. He touched me. I'm a big believer in making it personal with your leadership. And reading the books was one thing, but spending time with him was something else. What I found in my breakfasts at that stage in his life, because I really only knew him from 2011 to when he passed, right? So not very long. And he was just there for you, and he asked such good questions, and he dared to get 1 degree closer than most people dared, which was because he was genuinely interested. He seemed, I believe he was so genuinely interested in me and what I was thinking and how I was feeling that invited me to be more invested in our relationship. And, I write a lot about leading by listening, especially today, but he modeled it. He modeled it beautifully and invited me to get 1 step closer to being personal. My new book, the book I'm planning on working on, that's just starting, it's basically called One Step Closer. And in the foreword somewhere, I will be writing about Warren Bennis, who got 1 step closer than anybody else. I'll tell you, the other thing that was just wildly fun for me was, like, I've been a student of leadership for a long time. I have never met anyone who has had a larger personal collection of leadership books than me. Thousands of them. And I actually just moving out of my offices in Philadelphia, and I gave half of them away when I retired to Rutgers Business School. I'm giving the other half away to them. And I'm just saving a couple hundred. And Warren's are some of them. I'd say to him, did you know Maslow? And he'd say, yeah. We talked about, and he really never said it was a hierarchy. Everybody says it's Maslow's hierarchy, but it really wasn't a hierarchy. When I was talking to him, he was talking about the conditions for getting people engaged in work, and that you needed to pay attention to multiple levels of their being, all the way from the physical up to the peak of what is now the pyramid, the self-actualization. And I was like, wow, I'm talking to a guy who talked to Maslow. We had conversations like that. Your dad knew the Drucker, the people of the, as I've said, and I wrote, if there was a Mount Rushmore for the 20th century for leadership development experts, certainly Peter Drucker and your dad would be two of them that I'd have on my Mount Rushmore. It's tough on the next two, but those two are shoo-ins. I never knew Drucker. I had opportunities to meet him, but I was always too busy. Shame on me. But what a blessing to me, Warren. So what that blog was about was he touched me, and to me, leadership touch is what's missing right now.
Yes.
It's more relevant now than it was in the 20th century, only because he wrote about it in the 20th century. Nobody wants to listen to it today. But this is all about touch and connection. And whether you're dealing with CEOs or university presidents or football coaches or government officials, it's about how you connect and how you touch people and how you enable them to touch you. So that's what I was just moved. And then he liked to have breakfast with the viceroy, so he knew everybody. He had a different intern with him every time. I probably met 5 of them, but in 5 visits. The waitress, he knew all about her. She came from Russia, and her son is a tennis player. I was a tennis player. And whoever managed the restaurant and the clerk at the front desk. And I mean, Warren's here. It was like that's the only place I ever met him. But it was, for me, it was like his home away from home. And if I had a regret, George said to me, if you want to see Warren, you should go see him again, because he's not doing well. And I didn't. I called him, but I didn't go. And I, woulda, coulda, shoulda. I wish I'd gone. He sort of delighted in me. I was probably one of the younger CEOs that was really searching him out at that stage. I'm making my own trips all the way to California from New Jersey and New York to just have breakfast and to talk and to learn. Bill George is about 10 years older than I am. I was probably, that last 5 years, probably one of the only active CEOs that he was engaged with at the time. Certainly of the Fortune 500 folks, I was probably the only one. People at Southern Cal and people involved in the business school, there were people that were benefactors there that were important to him. But anyway, so I'm rambling, but that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
That is just beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I can't tell you, it just brings tears to my eyes. I just want you to know, don't have any regrets, because there's always regrets. There's never enough time. There's not, no one could have known.
I realize that every day these days. There's always somebody Wish we'd gone there. Wish
Yeah.
we'd been there, you know.
So I know Betsy has tons of questions, but I just have one that's burning for me because people talk about you. I loved what you said. I'm so glad it's the title of your book when you said One Step Closer. When as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, that's amazing. And it ties into so many of the other interviews we're hearing about sharing vulnerability in order to bring people that one step closer. And then it's reciprocated. And it's that relational piece. I love all of that. And I'm so glad your book will be about that. The question I have always is there a way to teach that? Because we're going to be working with 40,000 undergraduates and graduate students at a public university in Ohio who never knew him and have maybe read his books, but you even said that when you're in person with him, it was very different. So how do you teach? What can we share with them to give them a glimpse of how to do that?
First of all, we ought to celebrate him. The next generation of people that were authors in this space, I don't care if it's Brene Brown with vulnerability, Bill George with authenticity, Jim Collins with good to great, Warren, they're all building off of the shoulders of Warren's work. All of them, myself included. All of this is not new, right? It's more relevant than it used to be, but it's not new. If you went over the top 10 or 20 leadership people with their positionings, authenticity, vulnerability, Stephen M. R. Covey, trust, Stephen Covey, what do we call him? 7 Habits of Effectiveness. Your dad touched all of that stuff. And I'd be shocked if people hadn't studied him. So he laid a foundation that was relevant for my generation that I would say is relevant to others, to the next generation as well. Now, this is just my bias. I think we teach it all wrong. And because we're basically teaching people, here's what the enterprise wants from you, and here's what you have to do to deliver it. Vision, communicate. My latest work, which grows right out of his herding cats thing, I realized every leader is a cat. Every one of these 40,000 people are cats, and they're all different. They're 40,000 different people. And we're trying to help them lead with conviction and educate them, but they don't know what their convictions are. They're not in touch with who they are. Just like I wasn't in touch with who I was. So I think before they can get all this great academic stuff, which is, I'm not saying it's irrelevant. I'm saying before they can do that, they've got to get so much better anchored in who they are and how they want to show up. And then figure out, how does that connect with the world in which I'm working? I believe leadership needs to be personal. That's what I experienced with your dad. But we teach it in an impersonal way. Lists and traits and encourage some experience with it and trial and error. And then we have professors who have never done it who are teaching it. And then we have people who have done it but have never taught it. I'm like a unicorn because I've done it and taught it. Bill George is like a unicorn in that way. The opportunity area here is help these people get grounded in who they are. And that's what Stephen Covey did better than anyone else in my experience. You know, he said, you can think about leadership, and he taught principle-centered leadership. But he said, first figure out who you are. One of the first things I did when I met Stephen, he was another mentor of mine, and I spent a lot of time out at Sundance, was he said he wanted to know what my life story was all about and how that influenced who I was and what mattered to me. Then he wanted me to write all that down, not figuring out how I was going to be a better leader, but just get grounded in who you are and where you want to go. And then we'll help you connect that to the world of work or the world of leadership. You got to lead yourself before you can lead others. That was a powerful thought. And I don't think we do enough to help people lead themselves. So if I was going to do a Warren, I would make this all about the 40,000 cats. And you're going to get to know yourself better than you ever thought of. I run a boot camp. In 2 days, with a lot of pre-work, they spend 2 days examining their lives and where they want to go with them. Or one full day with a lot of pre-work and in groups and everything else. I've done this with thousands of people at this point. My observation is they basically put their past, their life story in the parking lot. They've gone to work and what does the boss want me to do? Not what do I want to do? What I'm being evaluated on these 13 criteria in my performance review. Oh, communication isn't very good. I got to become a better communicator. And then they start addressing the communication piece or quality of judgment or motivating and inspiring people or whatever's on the list. But they lose sight of who they are. They're so busy trying to meet the expectations of the leaders they are serving or the enterprise. And all of a sudden they go back to their own life story and they say, wow, I come from a family of substance here. I learned a lot from my parents, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my teachers. Those life lessons are really more powerful in terms of determining who I am than anything I'm going to learn at school. But school doesn't care who you are. Here's the class. You take it. It's missing the point. I tried to do this at Kellogg. They didn't buy it. And so I started doing it myself. But that's what's missing. That touch, that connection with who you are, and then connecting with others and looking for who they are, like your dad did with me, is to me what's missing. And that's something that could be a really unique kind of offering. To my knowledge, nobody does it. They have professors at Harvard and at Wharton and at Kellogg and at Chicago sort of doing it because they realize it's a neglected space. But in my experience, for the most part, they need to go one step closer than they do, and without violating anyone's sense of self or privacy. And we find that if you get people to dive deep, they get well anchored and they start to show up in a more compelling way, and they're more comfortable with who they are. So they're more comfortable talking to people and connecting with them as they are. That's the opportunity area. If we just start creating curriculum like the Kennedy School or Harvard or Kellogg or Wharton or Columbia, it's got a pretty good program. It's just another set of curriculum. I'd love to have some signature piece that's the touch of Warren.
You know what I love so much about this? First of all, you use the term, what matters to you? That's one of the questions. What matters to you that Stephen Covey asked you?
Yeah.
And I think about that quote from Dad, that becoming a leader is becoming yourself.
Yeah.
And that is one of the
it's that simple, and it's precisely that difficult.
Right? Exactly. And that's one of the tenets that we're really using as a major touch point for this entire program.
Well,
so I love this.
That's very compelling.
They're kids, they're kids, they're in college, they're kids. But my dad at age 19, my son's 19. And my dad at age 19 was marching into Germany in the infantry. Mm-hmm. So these kids can handle stuff. They can handle it.
And they need to. Mm-hmm. We need to fortify. We need to help them fortify themselves, because the world is not doing it. The world is pulling them apart. In order to be effective outside, you got to be more well-grounded inside. And the world's not helping. So that should be like the mandate. In our book, we say the only way out of this is by going in and getting in touch with who you are and letting that start to guide your journey. So what I would love to see would be the deep dive, the signature program that we're going to do a Bennis here. We're going to pull a Bennis and we're going to get closer. That's where the opportunity is. Otherwise, if we start going down his list of things, it's just a list. And theoretically, for me, whatever was to be created, all courses would connect to it.
Yes.
To who you are, and how are you going to bring vision to life? How are you going to communicate? How are you going to do your strategic thinking? All of the stuff ought to be inside out, not outside. Here's how you should do it. We've got the cart before the horse, it seems to me.
I completely agree. At Center for Public Leadership, when I was executive director and Warren was the head of the advisory committee, we had a program that was outside the classroom called Know Thyself.
Yeah.
And it was because we polled the graduate students and what were they missing? What did they feel they were missing? And these are the mid-career students that were average age was 38. And they're from all over the world. And they said they wanted more on self-knowledge, the patterns of behavior that were getting in their way. And these were a little bit of the older students, but he was all about self-knowledge. I mean, that was his whole, he was, and that whole thing, Kate, what's the quote that your dad used to say about your story? It's just, your story's just your story. He has a famous quote. I'll have to find it. Your story's just your story. It's not it's not
you. Like there was one from John Barth, the novelist, who was at the University of Buffalo when he was there. And I think I'm pretty sure that it was something like, well, Dad always used to say everybody has their story. And that was sort of his way of saying we're all the hero. We have to write ourselves into the hero of our own story.
My quote in my book, the quote that's most often quoted from the last book, The Blueprint, is your life story is your leadership story. You got to get your life story figured out before you can start leading. I'm a big believer in it. And I've had 3 different experiences where my life story was understanding my life story was essential to my own personal growth so I could rise to the challenges that I was encountering along the way. That's the opportunity area.
Doug, would you be willing to come in and work with us on developing that piece, bringing in your knowledge and your wisdom on that piece at the Institute?
Yeah. I'm actually teaching. I'm running a program. I'm on the board of the Partnership for Public Service here in DC. We've got all these starry-eyed 20-somethings who they would have loved Obama when including my daughter, when she came to Washington, D.C. to change the world. I got 70 20-somethings who all want to change the world and are not grounded in who they are. So we're doing a free boot camp for them starting next week. And we're doing the whole 2-day thing. And it's perfect for aspiring leaders. I'm also doing one at Hope College in Michigan, which is for college students. So where I was also on the board.
We should sit in on one of those.
I definitely want to do it. And what I'm also thinking is for a kickoff for the curriculum, wouldn't it be amazing to have you come when it actually gets really formulated and it's going to be, you would be such an inspiring opening speaker for that.
Well, I've got it down. I'm so passionate about it. And I was down in Palm Beach last month. And I did it with a group of CEOs, and they've lost their way too. It's a human conundrum. As the world's getting more chaotic, we've got to get back and grounded in who we are. And the CEOs found it the same way. Then I did another program in Tucson, Arizona, 3 weeks ago with Native Americans from Bristol Bay. and it resonated with them. You know, I do this thing when I do the talks. I say, okay, think about the person who had the most profound influence on you in your life. Think about who that is. Okay. And they think for a minute, okay, got it. And then I say, okay, you sit, three of you are going to talk about this. You get 2 minutes each to share who it is. And then you have to answer questions for 2 minutes. And in 12 minutes, we're going to be done with this. And then, so they all pick someone who had the most profound influence on them in their life. Very few people pick a boss, right? Nobody picks a boss. Okay? Nobody. Because there's not a close connection. So you say, okay, now this people had the most profound influence on you in your life. And then I have some things I talk about, like the need to be tough-minded and tender-hearted. Did they have high standards for you? Oh, yeah, they had high standards. Did they care about you? Oh, yeah, they had my back. They loved me. So they were tough, but they were kind, which is in this scarcity mentality world. People say, what do you want me to be? This is something I had trouble with. What do you want me to be, tough, or do you want me to be kind? And I didn't understand why I couldn't be both. Well, and it turns out everybody says, well, yeah, they were tough, but they also were kind. And then there are three ways to influence people: somebody else's work, Blaine Lee. Fear and intimidation. Did they ever try and intimidate you? Oh, no, that wasn't it. Were they transactional? Were they just, it's like pay for performance? You know, you do this, I'll do that. Were they transactional? Oh, no, that you don't get it. That's not the relationship they had. And they had the most profound influence on you in your life. Well, did they honor you? My word. And they said, well, yeah. They honored me. They honored my space. They honored my questioning. They honored all my desires to get better. They inspired me. They listened. They honored me, as your dad did with me. He honored me every time I was in his presence. And I said, isn't that interesting? These people had the most profound influence on you in your life. They had high standards and they cared about you. They didn't try to intimidate you. They weren't trying to get something out of you for a quarter. They simply honored you. And I said, I don't understand why we can't be those people with the people with whom we live and work. You don't need to go to the Warren Bennis Institute to get that. In fact, I would guarantee most of the people that people think about never got an MBA, never got a leadership degree. And yet those people had the most profound influence on these human beings. And somehow I would love to create a platform for us to have that kind of impact married to all the good stuff that Warren has written about. But we got to get one step closer than anybody else in order to do that. And I'd love to, that would be a fun project for me.
That would be so amazing. Oh my gosh, so amazing.
I had college, they weren't even graduates. I had a couple of people who hadn't been to college in the last one, but had gone straight to work and were successful in work. But they weren't college age. And I have some early college graduates too. So
it seems that you're onto something so powerful that I wonder if what would come from this is for you to train a few people like me and Kate. I'm just making this up, right? And so
we're actually working on that. We're working on that. And the book, The Blueprint, it's all based on the second book, The Blueprint. Actually, the first half of the book, of the Blueprint book, is the course, basically. And you can do it without me. It's not nearly as good.
Yeah, but, of course.
We started out writing this book on leadership, and we ended up deciding that rather than have my 10 things to compare to everybody else's 10 things, the most important thing was for people to do the self-exploration first. So we made that the first half of the book. And then we shared my 10 things in the second half for them to consider after they'd figured out what they wanted to do. I would love to make it available to you guys.
That book might be the textbook with one of Dad's books.
Oh, could be. Could be.
Right?
Yeah. We've tailored the book. We try to simplify it. I had some experiences where I spent years with working with Stephen Covey, and I had another mentor who I worked with for 20 years. And I tried to boil all that down to here's what you need to do in 2 days. And we boiled the ocean for the boot camp. But it's really all you need to get started on this process. So that's the process in one simple visual.
Wow.
There are 6 steps. I call it the stairway to heaven.
Wow.
And you can get it at my website too. But anyhow, I'd be happy to help with that or anything else. I know everybody. I've read just about everything that's been written in the last 30 years. When I was a kid, I grew up in Illinois, and if you grew up you started learning about Abraham Lincoln in kindergarten with his stovepipe hat. And I started following American presidents when I was, chopping down the cherry tree, the whole 9 yards. And then I got enamored with sports heroes and sports leaders. And then when I went into business, I started understanding business leaders. And I went into business in 1976. So going on 50 years of studying leaders while I was leading for 40 of those years. So.
But Doug,
anyway.
what's interesting is that you came out of your years of Campbell's Soup and you turned that company around.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you told me at lunch, I was so taken with, was the number of thank you notes that you wrote on a regular basis, right?
Well, yeah, those are the little things that mean so much, I wrote 10 to 20 a day for 6 days a week for 10 years. And on little cards, they weren't long letters, and I told you when I retired, Forbes asked me, well, how many letters did you write? We hear you write a lot. I said, yeah, I do. And handwritten and personal. And it turned out I'd written 30,000 of them, and we didn't have that many employees. Everybody, we were in 38 countries. Wherever you went in the world, tacked up in a cubicle was a note from Doug. Celebrating a contribution of significance to our company. It wasn't happy birthday. And telling him we were paying attention and we appreciated the effort. And as I shared with you, my observation is that most of all the companies that we prepare these people to go into typically become great critical thinking machines. I talked about this with your dad. They're built to find out what's wrong and to fix it. And even in the most broken companies, when I went to Campbell or RJR Nabisco after Barbarians at the Gate, when I went into both those companies, they were badly broken companies, but 8 out of 10 things were being done right. But nobody talked about what was being done right. Just, I found a problem, we're going to fix it. And think about parenting. If we were parenting our kids, you're a 19-year-old, just helping her with what she wasn't doing, with everything she did wrong. It doesn't work that way. And all the research says if there's if affirmation is worthy, you ought to do it. And not gratuitous, but meaningful. That's another part of my story.
Well, what I'm interested in is too, in your book Touch Points, where you met Warren and it became part of the imprint.
Yeah.
So Touch Points, did that journey of coming to Touch Points and your book come through your experience as the Campbell CEO? Because you turned the company around, right? So that's
using touch points, largely using touch points. Yeah. It's what, I don't remember the cover exactly. I don't think I have a book.
Right here, Touch Points.
Yeah, but if you go to the subtitle, Creating Powerful Leadership Connections in the Smallest of Moments, that's how you turn it around. It takes time. Stephen Covey said, famously to me, he said, Doug, you can't talk your way out of something you behaved your way into. You got to behave your way out of it. That company had behaved their way into a mess, And it was going to take us a long time, a lot of touch points, all those notes and a lot more to get it to a place where the people felt they had the wind at their back. It just took time. It's like trying to gain the trust of an abused child. It takes time. And I found that, and I also found that all these grand gestures that are the people's that become the mark of the CEO, those are one-hit wonders, one-time things. It's how you show up every day. My definition of integrity is real simple. What you see is what you get. And if you're showing up in a way that is aligned with the values you profess, and my values were, I lead, but I'm a values-driven leader. And you show up that way time and again, you'll have credibility and people will follow. And if you think you can lead through fear and intimidation, it's just not going to work. And sadly, all of the companies we're preparing these kids for are largely transactional. They're the middle column where you give me a fair day's work, I'll give you a fair day's pay. But that's not very inspiring. I mean, give me a break. We can do better. And these people are spending more of their working hours or more of their waking hours thinking about work than anything else they do. And we're talking about, I'll give you a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. That's not. And what Warren and Maslow were talking about was self-actualization, not fair pay. This is such a much bigger idea. I'm sorry. I'm getting on the soapbox time and again, but
I love
anyway,
what you're saying.
That's what it's 70 years.
What do you think that leaders now lack and need more of? Is it kind of this thing that you're talking about, less transactional, more personal, one step closer?
Well, I think that's part of it. I wish it was that simple, but I think that's part of it. Of all the work that I've seen that I think really that speaks to me, and a lot of people touch this, I think the two most powerful things actually come from Jim Collins' work. And the two things are humility and fierce resolve to sort of see it through, to realize this is a marathon, not a sprint. And to want to have the best minds in the room, minds and hearts, in the whole person, in the people in the room, and realize that there's always something for you to learn. I created my leadership model. And for me, the four things that are most important in my own personal leadership model are it's the axle to my whole model. It's honoring people, inspiring trust, having a growth mindset like Carol Dweck at Stanford. If you think you can grow, you probably will. And then the first thing is being real clear about what your highest ambitions are. And that's what I think we want to instill. We want to honor them. We want to honor each student's journey. We want to build their capacity to trust and learn. We want to instill a growth mindset. And we want to make sure that they're reaching high. I can't tell you how foreign this was as part of KKR and Barbarians at the Gate, but I had this saying that which I stole from Pamela Vol-Starr, who was a poet. She has this sonnet that says, "Reach high, for stars lie hidden in your soul. Dream deep, for a dream precedes every goal." And that's the language I was using to get these people to get out of the weeds and to reach high and realize their fullest potential. Now, admittedly, I have more than a little Don Quixote in me, but I believe that's doable. And that's what I think. And Warren believed that. And somehow I'd like to contribute to the development of that notion as being foundational to all the work.
One last question. When Dad was young, there was a sense of purpose and duty because of the Nazis in World War II, and a real sense of belief in purpose. And I think that what we're seeing right now, at least in my kids' ages, they just graduated from high school and they're both in college now, is generally a sense of apathy because they're feeling so bereft and so hopeless about actually having any power to change these huge problems. So,
well, they can't. They shouldn't. Well, yeah, they have to have their purpose. You know, the first thing you do when you build your leadership model with me is, what's your purpose? You can't change the world. You got to change yourself first. What's your purpose? And you go out from there. The next concentric ring is the people you're traveling with and working with. What's their purpose? And how does that ladder up to having a positive impact on the world? How are you going to have a positive impact in the world where you are right now? And so you start small and you get bigger, and you focus on your purpose. And people, the leaders I'm going to be talking to at the Partnership for Public Service next week, all want to change the world. My conversation with them on Tuesday of next week is you can't change the world until you change yourself. And you got to figure out what your purpose is before you can start to influence those around you. It's an inside-out process. And that's what we want to help these students get to. They got to figure themselves out first, and then they got to find out ways to smartly connect to have greater impact. I don't think there's any other way.
What I love about that is that it just breaks it down into each manageable piece so that it won't be as overwhelming. And I think that what the kids are really lacking is that sense of belief in that they're knowing themselves and belief in their own ability. And the idea that they're allowed to have a sense of purpose, for an individual sense of what they want.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think when I talk to them, I expect them to. You want to influence the world around you? Lean into it. Start to influence yourself. Figure it out. You can do this, and we got to give them the tools to do it. But my goodness, how else are you going to do it? I talk about leadership as a craft. When you were learning to ride a bike, you didn't ride the bike a few people did ride the bike the first time. Not many. They're nervous, and how am I going to do it? But they worked at it. They figured it out. The same thing's true about leadership. You gotta start small and get bigger. There are just no shortcuts here. And they want to think because there are shortcuts on Google to get whatever they want, there's shortcuts to influence others. Not going to work. Not going to work. No evidence that it works.
So much, Doug.
Okay.
We'll have, more to discuss. You were fantastic today.
Fantastic.
Well, I don't know about that. I hope it was helpful.
Oh, yes.
It was.
Okay.
No, you and it's all Warren. It's everything you said is just.
Oh, yeah. He's the foundation for all of this work. I can trace all of the famous thinkers of my generation back to him. That would be a fun problem. Anyway, there are not enough hours in the day. I've got to go. I've got another meeting.
Take care, Doug. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.